Hi, this is Robert Rapier from R Squared, and this is R Squared Energy TV. In this week's episode, I've got questions about peak oil and about carbon emissions trading markets. So first question, what do you make of all the recent announcements that the peak oil myth has passed and that peak oil has now been discredited? So there have been a number of articles in the last couple of weeks. First, there was an article in Nature that said oil's tipping point has passed. And in response, we got a lot of, Bloomberg had a story that said peak oil scare fades as shale and deepwater wells gush crude. There was an article in Forbes about the peak oil myth. There was the unfounded fear of the peak oil monster in U.S. News and World Report. My friend Chris Nelder tried to make sense of it all in an article he wrote called The Politics of Peak Oil. So what does this all mean? The people writing these articles, it sort of reminds me of Baghdad Bob in the first Iraq War, who would go on TV and he'd say, everything's under control, there are no troops in the area. The problem is, about all these peak oil arguments declaring that peak oil is dead and discredited, oil prices are still at $100 a barrel. So oil prices are not signaling that we're swimming in oil. It's true that oil production, like in the U.S., oil production's been on the rise, but it's also true that China and India are growing and consuming, incremental oil capacity that comes online. And so I've talked about peak oil in those sorts of terms for years, that peak oil is really the inability of supply to keep up with demand. So in that case, my scenario that I called peak light, which meant that we could have the sort of impacts of peak before we actually got to a physical peak. So the focus on physical peak may not be accurate. As oil has increased at 10 times the rate of inflation over the past 10 years. That is amazing, and that's suggesting something is going on. And I think it means that excess capacity is all gone. There's not much left in the world. And whether we've peaked or not, we are feeling the implications that we will when oil actually peaks, whether it's this year, next year, or 5 years, 10 years from now. I think we're in a new era where we are dealing with the implications of peak oil, whether people can point to a little bit more oil production or not. I mean, as long as oil prices are where they are and continuing pressure, upward pressure, then we have a problem. Okay, can you do an episode on your view on the topic of pricing climate risk with emphasis on the charging of CO2 emissions as a potential way to reduce our carbon footprint? And this question is for emissions on a global scale rather than just in the U.S. or Western Europe. I don't believe there will ever even be a mandatory carbon trading scheme in the U.S. Because there's just too much political opposition, and I certainly don't believe that China is going to get on board with that. These global warming conferences that they have in these places, Copenhagen and Durban, they turn out to be kind of circuses because all these people are looking out for their own agenda. And the emerging countries, they rightfully say, we should have the ability to develop with fossil fuels just like you did. So I've always said that we really lack the moral authority in the U.S. when we're using 20 barrels of oil per person per year to try to tell China how to develop without fossil fuels, or to tell some of these developing countries how to do it. We don't have the blueprint. We can't show them how to do it. So I really believe that they will continue to emit more. The Asia-Pacific region right now emits far more than the U.S., or in fact more than the U.S. and the EU combined. And by the end of the decade, they're on a trajectory that will take them to 50% of all global carbon emissions. So I don't think they're ever going to put a scheme in. Now, one scheme that's been suggested, Jeff Rubin suggested this in his book, Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, that if countries who import products from China and from some of these countries that don't produce GDP very efficiently, and that's China, some of the things that we outsource to them, they produce very inefficiently using a lot of coal. If we had an import tariff based on the embedded carbon dioxide in the in the products that we're importing, that would provide an incentive for them to get more efficient. But just simply them unilaterally or some kind of global agreement, I don't believe it's going to happen. I don't think China's going to do anything that's going to slow their growth down. They're not slowing down on their coal-fired power plants. They're building them just as fast as they can. So I think you'll see China's emissions continue to rise, and I don't think they'll be interested in a carbon emissions trading scheme. One point that I would make, a lot of people will. I've just written about this in my book about the. Some people use the analogy of the sulfur trading markets as a model of success, and this is how the carbon trading markets can work. The sulfur trading markets in the U.S. did work very well to reduce sulfur dioxide and to stop acid rain. But sulfur is very different. Sulfur is a very localized problem. So sulfur only lasts in the air a few days. So emissions in a coal-fired power plant in the southeast U.S. is not going to impact sulfur dioxide over China, and it's not going to contribute to a long-lasting global SO2 or sulfur dioxide concentration that's climbing. It's not going to affect it in that way. So it became, it's more of a local problem. So the U.S. passed laws in the U.S. that fixed that problem. CO2, even if we get our CO2 completely under control, the global nature of the problem is that doesn't mean that the emissions globally are going to be impacted at all. So that's my feelings on the carbon emissions markets. I think I don't think they were working very well in Europe. I think what really brought carbon emissions down in Europe was very high prices, and that's also what happened in the U.S. So just gas prices going up eventually caused people to conserve a little bit more, and that caused emissions to go down. I don't know that a carbon emissions trading scheme, which is really an indirect way of trying to increase fuel prices without the government taking the blame. I've always looked at that as kind of trying to shift the blame onto industry with the carbon emission trading schemes. The other point about the sulfur markets is sulfur was a point source, was much more of a point source coming out of power plants than carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide comes out of power plants, but also comes out of cars all over the place. And so it is very much harder to have pollution control equipment that takes carbon dioxide out of the air when it's being emitted by all these cars than it was in the sulfur trading markets. So there are a couple of very big differences there between that and the carbon markets. So that concludes this week's episode. Please tune in next week. If you have questions, please send them in. Thank you. Bye-bye.